Welcome to Distilling Arguments Part 3. In this video lecture, we're going to be looking at some more complicated examples of arguments that we have to extract from a larger body of text. So far, the arguments we've been looking at have been somewhat straightforward for the most part. These are going to involve a lot more interpretation on our part, and they're going to be just more complicated than the problems we've seen so far. In this video lecture, you're going to need to interact with it more than you have with previous ones. This will require pausing and working on problems and then coming back and seeing how I've solved those problems. Don't dismiss this or just blow through the exercises, as this is vital for your learning to actually stop and process the information and try yourself. As I've said previously, distilling arguments is really learning a skill, and like all skills, it requires practice. Furthermore, you're going to be tested on this on your upcoming exam, so it would be to your benefit to actually try to work through these problems and to do your best with them. So grab a pen and a pad of paper because you're going to have to work on a couple of problems today. The first problem we're going to look at comes from your textbook. If you look on page 96, you'll see exercise 4.6, and this is problem number 1. What I want you to do is to read through this and see if you can't figure out what the argument here is. I want you to distill the argument and then to diagram the argument. So, and also put it into premise-conclusion form. So let me back up a second. I want you to distill the argument, put it in premise-conclusion form, and diagram the argument. This comes from Sherlock Holmes, and there's an argument here, but there's a whole lot of information you don't need. So go ahead and pause the video lecture and do the very best you can with it. Well, I hope you were able to figure out what was being argued here. As I said, this is something that contains a lot of unnecessary information. And I'm going to try to walk you through my thinking process as I distill this argument and put it in premise-conclusion form and then diagram it. So just bear with me. I'm going to go through this and read it, and we'll see how we solve this problem. So, "Come now, Mr. Holmes," said he, laughing good-humoredly. "I'm an excellent subject if you can deduce anything from me." "I fear there is not much," I answered. "I might suspect that you have gone about in fear of some personal attack within the last 12 months. The laugh faded from his lips, and he stared at me with great surprise. "Well, that is true enough," said he, "though I have no idea how you know it." "You have a very handsome stick," I answered. "By the inscription I observed that you had not had it more than a year, but you have taken some pains to bore the head of it and pour melted lead into the hole, so as to make it a formidable weapon. I argued that you would not take such precautions unless you had some danger to fear." So, what exactly is going on here? Well, it seems that Mr. Holmes is trying to argue that this person has been in fear of some personal attack within the last 12 months. And so the conclusion comes to us in the second paragraph. I guess we'd call this a paragraph right here. And in fact, this second sentence that occurs in it, "I might suggest that you have gone about in some personal attack within the last 12 months, last year." The argument really doesn't come until the final paragraph down here. And so what we see is that there's a lot of unnecessary information that we can just ignore. And even in the information that we pay attention to, we can reword it in a more streamlined fashion, as we'll see later on. But I want to just go through and just go ahead and show you how I would eliminate unnecessary information and then identify the distinct propositions that are relevant to the argument. So it's going to look something like this. As you see here, there's just a lot of information that's not important. And as I've already told you, it seems that what I have listed down up at the top as number 1 is the conclusion. But how exactly is this argument going? It seems as if Holmes is trying to show that this person has been in fear of personal attack within the last 12 months. Well, what's his reasoning here? Well, he says the guy has a handsome stick, which, let me just say as an aside, that's a very funny thing to say to describe a stick as being handsome, but in any event. So he's got a stick. The inscription on it is not more than a year old. He's made it into a formidable weapon by pouring molten lead into the hole. And it seems that it is reasonable to assume that he wouldn't have taken precautions unless he had some fear of danger. Well, it seems to me that there are two arguments or sub-arguments going on here. One argument is trying to show that he has made a formidable weapon. Actually, three sub-arguments. One is trying to show that he's made a formidable weapon. Another one is trying to show that the weapon he has made, which is the stick, he's had less than a year. And then the third argument is, sub-argument you might say, is trying to tie those two arguments together to show that this person has been in fear of personal attack for the last year. Well, how does this argument go? Well, as I said, the first, what I have listed as 1 up here, this is actually going to be our conclusion. So right off the bat, we're going to have to reorganize what we've said. And here's how I think that should be done. So we see right here, the premise 1 would be you have a stick. The stick is inscribed with the date of a year ago. And from this, and this is what I have listed up here as number 3. Now, this wasn't actually stated in the initial argument. Go back a slide. We only have 6 distinct propositions that are relevant to the argument. Here, you might have noticed right off the bat, we've got 7. And what we see right here is that 3 is actually an implied conclusion. Now, I didn't list out to the side implied conclusion. I'll indicate that in my diagram. We're just going to use 3 here. We only write out to the side assumption. We'll never write out implied conclusion. But 3 is implied by the first part of the argument, that the stick has been inscribed with the date of a year ago. And if it has been inscribed with the date of a year ago and he has the stick, then it can't be the case that he's had the stick for more than a year. That just follows logically. Then he goes on to say you have filled the stick with lead. And from 4, that you have filled the stick with lead, he has made a formidable weapon. And then he wants to say, well, you wouldn't have made such a formidable weapon unless you had some fear of danger. And so within the past year, he's been in fear of some personal attack. Now, how exactly is all this fitting together? I mean, it seems like you might have a sense of how things are going, but how exactly do we diagram this argument? Well, if you look to the back of the book, which some of you may have done, you're going to see that it diagrammed it in just the following way. That the way that the author of this book understood it is that 2 is leading to the conclusion of 3, that you've not had the stick for more than a year, and then 4 is leading to the conclusion that you've made a formidable weapon. You filled the stick with lead, so you've made a formidable weapon, and then 1, 3, and 5 and 6 combine to yield the conclusion. So like I said, you really do have 3 sub-arguments. You have 2 to 3, that's 1 sub-argument, 4 to 5, that's 1 sub-argument, and then 1, 2, 3, 5, 1, 3, 5, 6 leading to 7, that's another sub-argument. So there are 3 sub-arguments within this entire main argument. Now, I understood this argument a little bit differently, and there are alternative ways to diagram this. And I'm going to share with you the way I was thinking of it. And here's how I came up with the diagram. The way I understood it was that 1 and 2 combined to yield 3. And the reason I said this is because the conclusion, the implied conclusion, is that the person has a stick and they've not had it for more than a year. So there are 2 parts to 3, that they not only is the stick not only a year old, but the stick is also within their possession. And if you look at 2 alone, this doesn't say anything or indicate anything about possession. You need 1 in order to attribute a possession to the individual. And so what I did down here is I said 1 plus 2 down arrowed 3C. And technically we should have probably put a 3C up here, but I was doing it the way the book had done it, so I had a slightly different diagram. But 3C in the diagram, this indicates that this conclusion was implied, that it wasn't explicitly stated. Now we come to 5, which is you have made the stick a formidable weapon. And again, the way I understood that was that 1 and 4 are combining to yield 5. And this can be a legitimate diagram here. You can reuse. This is possible. We haven't done it so far, but you can reuse a premise. This happens quite often. A person will you have a certain premise, they'll make one argument from it, then they'll go back to it and they'll use it to make another point. And I think this is a legitimate interpretation. Now, here's another possibility. You might have said 1 plus 2 down arrow 3c, and then just have said 4 and omitted the 1 here and just said 4 down arrow 5. So that's a third possibility. And then the way I understood this third sub-argument right here was I just said, well, look, you have a stick, you haven't had it, which you haven't had for more than a year. You've made the stick a formidable weapon. You wouldn't have done this unless you feared some attack. Therefore, within the past year, you've been in fear of personal attack. So the way I understood the main, or I shouldn't say the main argument, but this sub-argument right here, which I consider probably the core argument being made, I didn't include 1 on this line, on sub-argument 3. I thought of 1 as being part of this sub-argument up here. Sub-argument, we'll call this sub-argument number 1, being part of this to yield this implied conclusion. I also thought of it as being part of sub-argument number 2 over here to be part of the conclusion to 5. But there is some room for debate here, and I use this as an example to show you that there's not always one, and I've said this before, but there's not always one single correct way to diagram or interpret an argument. But there is typically a range of feasible interpretations. If your interpretation had concluded that the person wasn't in fear of personal attack, then something would have gone wrong. But as long as you have something in this ballpark, and especially if you can understand it after it's been presented, then you're probably on the right track. All right, now here's another argument, and I'm also going to want you to pause this and read through it and see how you can do with it. I'll give you a hint about this one. It has an implied conclusion. The conclusion is not explicitly stated, so this one's a little tricky. There's also an assumption this argument makes, so we're getting an implied conclusion and we're getting an assumption that's going to be present. So pause this. I know this one's probably the most confusing out of all of them, but pause this and see how you can do with it. Well, like I said, I know that was a little bit challenging. The language here is difficult to penetrate a bit. C.S. Lewis, some of you may know him from having written The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. He was not only was a prolific children's writer, but he wrote a great many things. He was actually a medieval scholar. But in any event, his language can be a bit dense at times. But let's see what C.S. Lewis argues here. He says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for these desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there's such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there's such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in the world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures can satisfy it, that does not prove the universe is a fraud. Now, what is he arguing here? What is his conclusion? It's a little unclear, but I think the implied conclusion is that I was made for another world. I think this is what Lewis is trying to argue here. And there's a certain assumption which I won't mention that assumption later on, but I'll save that for later. But this is the main argument, and most of what he's saying here is filled with just unnecessary examples, like a baby feels hunger, a duckling wants to swim, men feel sexual desire. All of that can be deleted. And then the final sentence itself seems to be just a reiteration of an earlier point he's made. I think that we can see that his main two premises are what I have listed up here as 1. Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. And then premise 2, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in the world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Notice that 2 is not actually the conclusion. And the reason I say that is it seems that he wants to make a more definitive conclusion than just a hypothetical one. He doesn't want to just say, well, if this were the case, then I would be made for another world. He wants to say, no, I am made for another world. He wants to draw an actual definitive conclusion, not just a hypothetical conclusion. So as I understand this, 2 is really a premise that implies I was made for another world. Now, if we were to put this argument in premise conclusion form, we're going to do it just as follows. Premise 1, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for these desires exists. Premise 2, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in the world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Therefore, I was made for another world. Now, how do we diagram this? As I said, there's an assumption this argument's making. We'll come back to that in a second. But first, I want to diagram it so we can see how these premises are being connected, because then I think the assumption will make a little bit more sense. Well, it's confusing. Is 1 and 2, are those independent premises? Well, they don't really seem to be independent premises. It doesn't seem that 1 is really supporting or giving an independent reason or a partial reason for thinking that the conclusion is true. 2 does seem to be supporting 3, but then we have to ask the question, well, how is 1 related to 2? Is it the case that 1 and 2 are dependent premises? I'm not really sure that that's the case either. The way I understand this is I think that what is going on is that 1 is actually supporting 2. And then 2 is leading to the implied conclusion, 3C. Now there is a certain gap in the logic, and I'll come to that in a second, but I want to comment a little bit on why I think that 1 leads to 2. If you read what 1 is saying, basically it's saying creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for these desires exists. In other words, if you let's say if you have a desire, or let me put it another way, is that you can't be born with a satisfaction for a desire unless that desire, you can't be born with a desire unless there's a possibility for you to satisfy that desire. In other words, if it's impossible to satisfy a desire for, let's say, X, then you can't be born with a desire for X. So, I don't know, I might have just confused the hell out of you. You can just read it and maybe that makes more sense. But creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for these desires exists. And then from that, what he wants to say, well, if it's basically impossible, for me to be born with a desire for something and not be able to satisfy that desire, well, then what's it say if I'm born with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy? Well, then the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Because, as I was saying, or the last sentence he said in the previous, I'll go back a slide, is the last thing he said was, if none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove the universe is a fraud. Now, I don't think that really adds to the core of his argument, but I think that does serve to reiterate this point, which is that, let's suppose you do have a desire that nothing in the world can satisfy. What that doesn't mean that the universe is a fraud. That just means there has to be something out there which can satisfy it, and if nothing in this world can do it, there must be something outside of this world that can do it. Right? It doesn't mean that your desire is false in some way. That's what Lewis is saying here, that if you have a desire for something, it has to be possible to satisfy that desire. So what does that mean if you have a desire for something that's not of this world? Well, then it must mean that it can be satisfied by something outside of this world. But notice that 2 is just a mere hypothetical. There's an assumption that has to be made in order to get to the conclusion, therefore I was made for another world. Because what if somebody said, well, look, yeah, I agree. If you have a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, that would entail that, there's something outside of this world that can satisfy it. Well, but it just turns out that I don't have any such desires. I don't have any desires. All of my desires can be satisfied by things within this world. So that might be a little confusing, but maybe this next sentence will make sense. Lewis has to be assuming something like this. I have a desire that no experience in the world can satisfy. He has to make this assumption because independently of it, at most he could have a hypothetical conclusion down here. Notice, this is just a mere hypothetical. It's I hope what I'm about to say is not confusing to you, but he's basically saying the following. He's saying if A, then B, and you can't conclude from that B. If you're saying if A, then B, you have to then establish that A is true in order to conclude that B is true. And if he wants to conclude that B is true, we're going to say I was made for another world, just like I was made for another world. He's saying that right there. He has to first establish, well, I do in fact have a desire that no experience in this world can satisfy. So this is an assumption this argument is making, and once this is pointed out, here's how we would, in the end, diagram this argument. 1 leads to 2, 1 implies that 2 is true, and then 2 and 3a lead to the implied conclusion 4c. So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. That one, I have to confess, is a little confusing to me just due to the language, and honestly some of this just doesn't even seem true to me, but whenever you're dealing with premises that are false, it always makes it a little challenging. But in any event, this is, I think, a fair reconstruction of this argument and how we would diagram it. All right, next problem. This one's also a really interesting one, and I want you to take a second and pause the video lecture and see how you would go about distilling this argument, putting it in premise conclusion form, and then diagramming it. So go ahead and do that. Alright, well, imagine this one was a little bit confusing to some of you. Let me go ahead and read this and we'll see what we come up with. There are 3 possible parts to a date, at least 2 of which must be offered: entertainment, food, and affection. It is customary to begin a series of dates with a great deal of entertainment, a moderate amount of food, and the merest suggestion of affection. As the amount of affection increases, the entertainment can be reduced proportionately. When the affection is the entertainment, we no longer call it dating. Under no circumstances can the food be omitted. And you might be wondering, well, what exactly is the argument here? What is the conclusion? And if you're wondering that, you were on the right track, because this was a trick question. This was not an argument at all. So I know some of you are pissed off at me right now. It's like, I just spent 10 minutes trying to figure this out. Well, I had to throw this in because there's going to be one like this on your homework that's not an argument. There are going to be some like this on your test where you have to distill it and it's not even an argument. So always be on the lookout for that. This is just merely describing parts of a date. And like I said, this is not an argument. It's just a mere description, a mere explanation of what's... Actually, it's not even an explanation, not explaining anything. It's just merely describing it. So, not an argument. So sorry for any consternation I just called. Alright, this is the last one, and this one is also a pretty tricky one and a very complicated example indeed. And I'm going to give you a hint for this. The conclusion is not stated. It is an implied conclusion. So this one is probably, I don't know if it's the most difficult one of today, but it is a fairly complicated one. So I want you to do your best with it and work through it. Like I said, the conclusion is implied. Alright, well, let's see what we came up with. So I'm going to go ahead and read this and then tell you what I think the implied conclusion is. The welfare state rests on the ideal that man is unselfish, but it is futile to attempt to run a society on this principle, because we can see people being selfish every day. People are saving money for their old age and working hard to improve themselves by taking courses and losing weight. No society that presupposes unselfish instincts can work. Well, what is this arguing? Well, it seems like it's saying something negative, and let me back up a second. It's not at first clear what this is arguing. I mean, there's definitely one argument that's clear that it's making, is that we see people being selfish every day, and it makes an argument for that. But it's also talking about the welfare state. It's not simply talking about people being selfish. That's not the only argument. It seems actually the main argument it's making is about the welfare state. And it connects something negative about the welfare state with presuppositions that the welfare state makes, which is that it rests on the ideal that man is unselfish, but we see people being selfish, and then it comes back to say no society that presupposes unselfish instincts can work. So what's the argument here? It says the welfare state rests on the ideal that man is unselfish. It is futile to attempt to run a society on this principle because we see people being selfish every day. What is being implied? The welfare state rests on the ideal that man is unselfish. You can't run a society on this principle. So what? It seems that it's implying the welfare state will not or cannot work. There is a subtle difference there between saying will not or cannot, but we'll just say will not work. And that seems to be the argument here. And we can go through it and we can identify all the distinct propositions in the following way. The welfare state rests on the ideal that man is unselfish. 2, it is futile to attempt to run a society based on this principle because, notice our indicator word here, because, it's one of our premise indicator words, because people are saving money for their old age. And 5, working hard to improve themselves by taking courses and losing weight. No society that presupposes unselfish instincts in people can work. And we can put this argument in premise conclusion form, I think, in the following way. Now, we're not quite out of the woods yet because we need to clarify some of the language in this. And I want to focus on premise 2. It says, it is futile to attempt to run a society on this principle. What is it referring to? What is the term this principle? What is that referring to? Well, it seems like it's referring to back to 1 where it says the welfare state rests on the ideal that man is unselfish. So the principle is the ideal that man is unselfish, or we might just say on unselfishness, right? It is futile to attempt to run a society based on, we might say, the principle of unselfishness. So I just wanted to clarify the language here because when we're putting this in premise conclusion form, I don't want something that just says this principle, because if you're just reading this, that would be a little unclear. So we need to identify that we are talking about unselfishness just for clarity's sake. Now that we've done that, I want you to read through this argument again because there's something a little odd about it as it's stated. The welfare state rests on the ideal that man is unselfish. It is futile to attempt to run a society on unselfishness. We see people being selfish every day. People are saving money for their old age. People are working hard to improve themselves by taking courses and losing weight. No society that presupposes unselfish instincts in people can work. Therefore, the welfare state will not work. Did you see anything odd at all? You probably saw a lot of things odd, but one thing I want to call your attention to is premise 2 and premise 6. It is futile to attempt to run a society on unselfishness. And then number 6 says, no society that presupposes unselfish instincts in people can work. And I want you to tell me, what's the difference between these two? It seems like they're saying the exact same thing. To say it's futile to run a society on unselfishness seems like it's equivalent to saying a society based on unselfishness can't work. So here what we see going on, if we were to scroll back to this, it seems that what's going on is that basically when they say number 6 down here, they're just repeating what they said in number 2. 6 is just a restatement of number 2. And when we're putting an argument into premise conclusion form, we can delete any such redundancy. And here we could delete 2 or we could delete 6. It really doesn't matter, but I'm just going to delete 2. And once we do that, we can condense the argument in the following way. So we did that just because, as I said in the previous slide, 2 and 6 are just saying the same thing. There's really nothing that 6 is adding in any important way. So we're just going to delete that. Now look at this argument again, and you might be a little bit confused by it because we've just listed these propositions basically in order that they were given to us. And to me, this argument seems a little bit jumbled. And I would say that the core of the argument is really 1, 5, and 6. For a moment, just ignore 2, 3, and 4. Just don't put them out of your line of sight. And read along with me. Number 1, the welfare state rests on the ideal that man is unselfish. Premise 5, no society that presupposes unselfish instincts in people can work. Therefore, the welfare state will not work. So I would say that really what's going on here is that 1, 5, and 6 constitute a sub-argument unto themselves. And I think that's really the main argument that the person is trying to make, or you might say the core of the argument that they're trying to make. But then we have 2, 3, and 4. And read ignore 1, 5, and 6 and look at 2, 3, and 4. We see people being selfish every day. People are saving money for their old age. People are working hard to improve themselves by taking courses and losing weight. It seems like there's a sub-argument going on right here. This is a separate argument. And I want to suggest to you that 2 is really the conclusion. What the person is trying to establish in sub-argument 1 is that people are selfish. And why are people selfish? Well, we see them saving money for their old age. We see people working hard to improve themselves, right? And 3 and 4 are really giving us reasons to think that 2 is true. Now, once we've established this, what we're going to have to do is rearrange this entire argument because, as I said, you want to keep sub-arguments together. And basically the way this argument is stated, we state 1, we ignore that, we then make this other argument, 2, 3, and 4, then we come back to the sub-argument in 5 that 1 was a part of, and it's just confusing. So we're going to reorganize this in the following way. Number 1, people are saving money for their old age. Number 2, people are working hard to improve themselves by taking courses and losing weight. Therefore, we see people being selfish every day. And notice that this conclusion follows from 1 and 2. Now we move on. No society that presupposes unselfish instincts in people can work. The welfare state rests on the ideal that man is unselfish. Therefore, the welfare state will not work. And here we have our 2 sub-arguments. And notice they've been rearranged to be a nice, neat, logical sequence. 3 follows from 1 and 2. We establish 3 as we move down. Then we establish 6 from 4 and 5. So now we have our sub-arguments. They've been reorganized so that we're not jumping back and forth. Okay, well, you thought it was over, but it's not. We're not quite out of the woods yet. Because this argument does something that we haven't seen before. And you might not have noticed this, but once I point it out, you're going to be scratching your head and you may have noticed it, but there's really no overlap between these 2 sub-arguments. And every extended argument we've seen, what has occurred is a person will argue, they'll say 1 and 2 leads to 3. 3 is the conclusion of the first sub-argument, and then it acts as a premise leading to the main conclusion. But notice here, the main conclusion is established from 4 and 5 alone. In theory, we could delete 1, 2, and 3, and we'd have a perfectly compact and enclosed argument right here in 4, 5, and 6. 1, 2, and 3 don't really seem to be doing anything to support 4, or to support 5, or even to support 6. It seems like a completely independent argument that is not connected with the conclusion. But clearly the person believed when they were making the argument that 1, 2, and 3 were connected to 4, 5, and 6. And so what we're going to have to do is identify some kind of implicit premise that will serve as a bridge from 3 to 4. So this is an interesting argument because what we have are really 2 isolated arguments going on, 2 self-contained arguments that clearly the person making the argument intended that they not be self-contained, but that's actually what ended up happening is that they were. So we're going to have to identify some assumption here that is going to link 3 to the rest of the argument. And I'm going to suggest one, but I think it's something like the following. A society must be based on instincts we observe in people. And what this enables us to do is, if we make this assumption, then notice, let's start at the beginning. People save money for their old age. People are working hard to improve themselves. Therefore, people are selfish, right? So we have people are selfish, or we observe people being selfish every day. A society must be based on instincts that we observe in people every day. Therefore, no society that presupposes unselfish instincts can work. So we've basically, by inserting this assumption right here, premise 4, we construct a new sub-argument. 3, 4 lead to 5. And basically, 1 through 4, all of this, 1 through 4, is being used in order to defend this one premise right here, 5. 1 through 4 are building up to defend 5. And then we have the core of the argument represented. Oh, and I should have changed my numbers down here. I'm sorry. That should actually say 5 and 6. So sorry for that typo. But in any event, we see that 1 through 4 are leading up to support 5, and then 5, 6, and 7 lead to the main conclusion. So this one took a lot of work just to get it in premise conclusion form, but hopefully you can see how everything builds to the next thing. 1 and 2 lead to 3. 3 and 4 lead to 5. 5 and 6 lead to 7. Now we come to the fun task of diagramming the argument. And let's start at the top. People are saving money for their old age. People are working hard to improve themselves by taking courses and losing weight. Therefore, we can see people being selfish every day. So 1 and 2 are supposed to support 3, and the question we have to ask is, are 1 and 2 dependent or independent premises? And again, the way we answer this is we ask, people saving money for their old age, is that even partial evidence that people are selfish? Well, yeah, that is partial evidence. How about people working hard to improve themselves by taking courses? Is that partial evidence? Yeah, that is. So 1 and 2 are independent premises. And so what we're going to find is that 1 and 2 lead to 3 independently of one another. I think actually my animation is just going to do all this at once, but here we go. 1 and 2 lead to 3 independently of one another, and then all the remaining sub-arguments, they exist as dependent premises. 3 and 4, they are dependent on one another to establish 5. And we list 4 over here with an A, again because 4 was an assumption we identified. 5 and 6, they work together in order to establish 7. And again, we list 7 with a C because 7 was an implied conclusion. So by looking at this diagram, we can see that 1 and 2 are given us independent reasons for 3, and then everything else in the argument, all the remaining sub-arguments, the premises are working together dependently to establish their respective conclusions. So in a way, how many sub-arguments do we have here? Well, 1 to 3 is one sub-argument, 2 to 3 is another one, so that's 2, then 3 and 4 to 5, that's 3, then 5 and 6 to 7. That's 4 sub-arguments going on here in this one entire extended argument. And by doing this, not only are we able to understand the logical structure of the argument, but we can also identify any weak places that we might see in this argument. And I think there are some pretty obvious weaknesses with this, and I think the main weaknesses with it are going to be sub-arguments 1 and 2 here. I mean, it just seems to me a little preposterous to say that people are selfish because they're saving money for their old age or they're working hard to improve themselves. I mean, those actions might be self-interested, but being selfish and being self-interested are two different things. You know, I go to the doctor when I'm sick. That's a self-interested act. That's not a selfish act. A selfish act is basically, sorry, we're getting philosophical here, but a selfish act is when you ignore the interest of others when you ought not to. A self-interested act, that's selfish. A self-interested act is just when you look out for yourself. And there's nothing wrong with looking out for yourself as long as you're not ignoring the interests of others when you really should be paying attention to their interests. Saving money from my old age, I'm not denying or in any way kind of overriding somebody else's rights in that instance, or working to improve myself or working hard to lose weight. Again, I'm not in any way trumping someone else's rights in doing that. I'm just looking out for myself, which is a perfectly reasonable and moral thing to do. So anyways, I mean, that's one place we could object to this argument. There are other places that we could also look to reject this argument, but I was just trying to give you an example of how we might then go about evaluating the argument. I bet you guys right now are thinking, man, I didn't know it was going to be this good when I signed up for this class. Well, I know it's a barrel of monkeys, it really is. But the good news is the fun never ends, because guess what? You have some homework assignments to do. And the homework assignment, as you can see here, you do one problem from page 96, and then you'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 problems from page 100 to 102. And what I want you to do for all of these, and I didn't say it up here for problem 2, but I would like for you to do it for it as well, is I want you to put these in premise conclusion form and diagram them. Make sure to identify any implicit premises if you happen to see them. Note also, I'm going to give you a heads up just to help you out, There's one problem up here that's not an argument, so be on the lookout for that one as well.